Welcome to the thematic forum on financing resilience of transition infrastructure. This session will focus on addressing solutions for mobilizing finance in resilient infrastructure transitions. Our speakers will present learnings from national infrastructure pipelines from different geographies and economies to explore resilience implementation in transitioning infrastructure and the way forward. Our moderator of the day is Mr. Daniel Steitmuller. I hope I pronounced that right. He's the team lead at the Secretariat of the Insure Resilience Global Partnership. Daniel oversees the coordination of the program alliance and the partnership's alliances of operating programs. He also coordinates the development of the monitoring and evaluation framework and evidence agenda for the partnership, as well as the partnership's work on integrating risk finance into broader resilience and adaptation efforts. Over to you, Mr. Daniel Steitmuller.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and a warm welcome to all participants joining us from all across the world. I'm really pleased to be here. Maybe for those of you who don't know what the Insure Resilience Global Partnership is, we are a multi-stakeholder partnership with the joint vision and ambition to close the protection gap in vulnerable countries and to make disaster response better and more timely through the use of prearranged disaster risk financing and insurance instruments. So the work the work of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is obviously very close to our own mission, and the coalition started a series of dialogues focused on risk financing and financing of resilient infrastructure, and they initiated a partnership with us, and this session is part of this series of dialogues, and I'm really excited to kickstart and to dive into a discussion today which will really focus on some of the main challenges in mobilizing finance to facilitate a transition into resilient infrastructure, but also to look at pathways and to identify solutions on how this financing can be mobilized. And we will focus on three core issues in the discussion. Firstly, what are the disclosures, tracking, and labeling of resilient and sustainable infrastructure that can drive this forward? Second, what are some of the advancements in risk analytics and risk assessment that can help facilitate and inform investments in resilient infrastructure? And thirdly, what are some of the financing instruments and financing solutions that seem to be most promising and work best for this vast challenge that lies ahead? Before I introduce our panelists, and we have a great and very diverse panel here with us, we have a poll for the audience, and we would like to engage the audience directly with the question, and I hope everyone can see the first poll question on the screen now, which is, in your opinion and based on your experience, which financing instrument will attract most funds for resilience of infrastructure? A, loans; B, bonds; C, equity; D, mezzanine capital, that is a combination of debt and equity; E, impact funds, a very innovative and novel type of instrument, which we may hear more of during the discussion; and F, blended finance, so essentially a combination of public and private finance. So while we let the audience answer the poll, allow me to introduce the panelists today. Our first panelist is Mr. Baldeo Purushartha. He is the Joint Secretary at the Department for Economic Affairs at the Ministry of Finance of India. he has served multiple positions in the government of Punjab and the government of India. So a warm welcome to you, Mr. Purushartha. Our second panelist is Mr. Ernesto Lopez from the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Peru. He's an expert in public policies and regulation and a university professor, and he has put his experience and knowledge at the service of public and private organizations, as well as investors and companies that need to adapt to sector regulations. Mr. Lopez is not with us live here today, but he has pre-recorded a presentation on the national infrastructure pipeline in Peru. So we are looking forward to that. Our third panelist, and I hope he is with us today already. He was missing at the beginning, but I understand he's about to join. So let me introduce him already. Mr. Solomon Asamoah, he is the CEO of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund. He has over 25 years of experience in transactions and has led over $4 billion in transactions across the African continent. And in his role as CEO, he oversees origination, structuring, and investment of infrastructure-related projects across Ghana. So these panelists will present some of the or very interesting insights into the national infrastructure pipelines of each country. So we have a very diverse and broad set of presentations from different regions, geographies, and economies. And after that, we will go dive into a discussion with some very interesting and also diverse practitioners. And our first discussant I'd like to introduce is Mr. Dickie Whittaker, who is the Chief Executive of the Oasis Loss Modeling Framework. He has over 30 years of experience in the reinsurance business and in risk analytics, and he has specialized in risk and innovation, linking academia, government, and finance. And Dickie's onto many interesting things at the moment with Insur-Resilience and the Insur-Resilience and the Insurance Development Forum. And speaking of the Insurance Development Forum, our next panelist is Mr. Rowan Douglas, who is the head of climate and of the Climate and Resilience Hub at Willis Towers Watson in the UK. So in this role, he supports the management, regulation, and financing of risks from climate, terrorism, cyber, and other perils. And in 2015, he founded the Insurance Development Forum alongside with the World Bank, UN, and global industry leaders to address the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Last but not least, we have two panelists from the European Investment Bank. Nina Fenton is the head of regional representation in South Asia. She holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Oxford, and she has extensive experience in international development, having worked in 3 of the largest international financial institutions in covering countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And with her is Mr. Roman Röhrl, climate change specialist at the Environment, Climate, and Social Office of the European Investment Bank in South Asia. And he's a climate change specialist with many years of experience in Asia and elsewhere, and has worked in particular on climate risk assessment systems, alignment with the Paris Agreement, EU taxonomy, and the Task Force for Climate-Related Finance disclosure recommendations. So a warm welcome to all of you today. I am now asking the studio if we already have results from the poll. If that is not the case yet, we can go to that later on. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Purushartha to give a presentation on the national infrastructure pipeline in India. Mr. Purushartha, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for a wonderful presentation. I will limit myself to speak on NIP and its parallel developments, in the overall context of the theme which has been given. And I thank CDRI for giving me this wonderful opportunity to present on this August forum. Next. Friends, the NIP started with the vision given by Honorable PM in 2019 of investing more than $1.5 trillion in infrastructure, that also across the spectrum of infrastructure, and with the overall outcome of enhancing the ease of living for the citizen of the country. Next. And this vision of Honorable Prime Minister has developed into India's Infrastructure Vision 2025, which talks of development across the spectrum of infrastructure. It talks of providing affordable and clean energy. It talks of providing digital service across, all divides. Please go back. Across all divides. Then there is a quality education and healthcare issue. It also talks of efficient transportation and logistics, housing for all, and water supply to all. This is very important, social resilience issue. And then there are disaster resilience standards also built into NIP. It also talks of enhancing farmer income by, improving farm infrastructure. And then the overall idea is how to enhance the living standard of citizens of the country and meeting out the aspiration of the citizens of country. And as you can see that all these goals which have been part of Infrastructure Vision 2025 are aligned with the UN's SDG goals. Thank you. Next. So NIP is based on this infra vision, and it is first of a kind bottom-up approach in India. Here we have started compiling all the projects and taking projects from the project sponsoring authorities rather than commanding from above that which project is to be taken and which project is not to be taken. We have said that all the projects, because you understand India is a federal country, there are three layers: national, sub-nationals and local government. So we started taking up projects from all the levels, projects which they think that this is important for their region, for their development, for their aspirational level. And there is a threshold that 100 crore and more projects will be covered in this NIP. It covers all the projects across infrastructure sector, whether they are brownfield or greenfield projects, whether they are economic infrastructure or social infrastructure, everything is part of the NIP. And NIP portal as a whole provides various information to all stakeholders. So it provides information to the developers and investors. They can go and see which are the projects there, what kind of opportunities are available there, what kind of roles are available there in those projects for them, the location of the project and all other details. At the same time, it also provides a digital tool for the implementers, for the executors of the project to see how projects is progressing further, which are the shortcomings and where those shortcomings are coming and how to address that. And this has in turn a multiplier effect on the GDP of the country. Next. So this is just one example how it has grown up. So when it started in 2020, it started with more than 6,000 projects across 22 states and UT, and now in 3 years it's had grown to more than 9,000 projects across 27 states and UT. So this is one example of success of the entire concept NIP. Next. This is just the financial structure available for NIP. There are two important things here. If you see that the expenditure which was made in last 5 to 6 years, that is between 13 and 19, that is around 56 lakh crores roughly, if you translate into dollars, with $0.75 trillion. Now we are planning to invest more than double. So it's almost $1.5 trillion into 5 years. And if you see the bifurcation, you can find out that the majority of funding is coming from state government and central government. So basically it's the state funding which is coming, but there is a very robust part of private funding also, which is almost 20% of NIP, either coming through PPP projects or pure private projects, because NIP also includes pure private infrastructure projects. Next. Sectoral composition of NIP shows that transport and energy are the two main drivers of NIP. But you can find out that there is a healthy mix of social and economic infrastructure projects. So water and sanitation is equally important, and at the third largest component of NIP. So does affordable housing. So this NIP is not only concentrated generally on economic infrastructure, which we see in terms of transportation projects or energy projects or some other visible infrastructure, but also in terms of social infrastructure project, which is giving direct benefit to citizens and making their life better in more closer ways than the economic infrastructure. Next. This is the execution, stage-wise execution division of NIP. And in NIP, we have included projects at 3 stages. One is under conceptualization, where the project is at the drawing board, nothing concrete has happened. And then there is a development stage, where the DPRs are being prepared, transaction advisors are identified, and project is developing into tendering mode of project execution. So that is covered under development stage, and then when it is tendered out, it comes into under implementation stage and actually implemented at the ground level. And after implementation is complete, it becomes completed project. So the good thing here is that in last 3 years, 50% of projects have reached under implementation stage in NIP. Next. This is the financing mix of NIP. So big question, if we are taking a project's worth $1.5 trillion, from where money will come? So half of the money is coming through government budgetary supports and PSUs, central PSUs accruals. But the rest of money is coming in terms of various, financial instruments. It's lending by banks and NFCs also, equity contribution, multilateral lending. Then we have come up with a new DFI, which is NABFED. We have set up, it's a huge DFI in India, and that will participate in financing of infrastructure projects. Still, there is a shortfall of 10 to 11%. And to meet out this shortfall, we have come up with another flagship initiative of Government of India, which is called National Monetization Pipeline. Next. So there are 3. Now, NIP is just one aspect of taking the infrastructure issue, how to develop infrastructure. But there are 2 more parallel initiatives, which is National Monetization Pipeline and PM Gati Shakti Master Plan. National Monetization Pipeline is actually a set of brownfield, COD, post-COD infrastructure projects, which are already functioning and working in the field. And those projects are, through tendering process, transferred to private investors and developers for a limited period, so that we can bring private efficiency into the running of that project, and at the same time government unlocks the value of its investment made into those projects. So we envisage that through NMP almost 5 to 6% of that shortfall will be met out, because NMP is total money which can come out of NMP is around $86 billion. Now there is again PM Gati Shakti Master Plan, which is first of its kind in India, where we are putting all the infrastructure projects across 8 ministries, 8 economic ministries on one platform to ensure that they complement each other and a collaborative development of infrastructure takes place in any region rather than a standalone infrastructure coming here and there. Next. So NIP recognize this entire concept of disaster and climate change resilience of infrastructure, and there are studies which says that 60% of total losses in any disaster is due to infra losses. That is further proven by, I have given data of 2 cyclones, one cyclone and one flood in India, which says that 50% of losses were due to infrastructure losses. So this is very important thing, and if we do not take care of this issue today, this will further result into more losses into infrastructure. And it's not only financial losses, because infrastructure are very much related to the life of the people. It has also adverse impact on their life and ease of living. Next. So here PM Gati Shakti comes in, And one very important issue of any infrastructure development in any region is to take it up in a holistic manner rather than a standalone. You cannot build a road and say that there is an infrastructure unless it is complemented by other modes of transportation. One cannot build an airport and say that they have provided air connectivity to the place unless it is connected with other mode of transportation. So seamless integration of infrastructure is very much important. And that is also important point of view that during disasters, these infrastructure do complement each other. So if one infrastructure is damaged, you can use another infrastructure to complement that. If there are buildings, school buildings and hospitals are there, many times they can complement. If one gets damaged, you can start things in another building also. So this holistic approach of infrastructure development is very important, and that's why entire infrastructure of such a vast country like India is put up on a GIS, layers map, which takes care of all the legacy infrastructure and all the planned infrastructure, and see that whether they do complement each other or not, whether any last mile connectivity issue is missing or not. Next. And the report saying that 85% of global investors are driven by ESG concerns. It also said that in future this will go further up, and maybe 1/3 of the global assets will be driven by ESG consideration. Keeping all this in mind, this is one report, there are several other reports. Keeping all this in mind, we are working more towards how to ensure ESG ratings and promote sustainable finance for infrastructure. SEBI has, on the one hand, they have updated their existing reports pro forma to ensure that these things get captured, and at the same time they have also issued a consultation paper to suggest on how to decide the standards of ESG rating providers. Next. There are several initiatives Government of India has taken, or they are in the pipeline. Some have been announced in a budget of this year also, for mobilizing finance for sustainable infrastructure. So we are working on sovereign green bonds, which are going to finance green infrastructure. We are working on blended finance, where government and private funds are coming together and with focus to climate action sectors. Then there is a sustainable finance group set up by RBI to look into these issues. And for example, I said that in a priority sector lending for renewable energy projects, the threshold of bank loans have been enhanced for both household as well as firms. Next. This is very important, friends. And this, because this shows that India, when India talks of these issues, it's not merely talk. It results into action also. And this is showing the steel of our resolve. In COP21, India has committed that they will achieve 40% of installed capacity from non-fossil sources by 2030. And you will be pleased to know that we have achieved it today. So that shows that we can achieve things before time, before commitment. And now in COP26, our PM has announced far more ambitious program by saying that by 2070 India would be net zero emission country. And he has given 5 nectar action points, which says that by 2030 we'll generate 500 gigawatt of renewable energy. Then 50% of energy requirement would be by renewable sources by 2030, reduction of carbon emission by 1 billion tons by 2030, and reduction of carbon intensity of economy by 45% by 2030. These are very, very ambitious action points, but we are hopeful, as we have shown, that we can achieve results before time. We will achieve these results also before 2030. Next. Because there are n number of initiatives which have been already taken by Government of India, some are in the pipeline. I cannot name all, but I have taken few to just give a glimpse of how things are moving in right direction. So initiatives are being made to make transportation as green as possible. So India is coming up with EV vehicle policies, battery swapping policy, which is very important, because in urban areas, battery charging takes a lot of time. You go to a charging station with your car, it takes hours to charge your car. And for electric buses also. So battery swapping could take care of this issue by quickly swapping the battery, and therefore finding out standards of such initiatives is very important. Then production link incentives, where we are incentivizing certain sector of manufacturing for intended outcome. In almost all production link incentives, we have kept a percentage for green and innovative technologies. And there are few production link incentives, especially one on the solar module production also, because this is very important if we want to move towards renewable energy in a quick way. And then grid connected rooftop solar program is going on very well, and we have already achieved 4,000 megawatt rooftop solar capacity addition. Next. Then for commercial building utilization for solar energy generation, we are coming up with ESCO models. One very important thing is biomass co-firing is allowed in thermal plants in India. Up to 5 to 7% of fuel requirement would be through biomass. And this is very important because one of the problem we are facing, especially in North India, is burning of stubbles in the field, which creates a lot of pollution and greenhouse gases. Now that stubble and other biomass could be used in thermal plants, which can bring down the requirement of coal uses as well as helping the environment. Then we have come up with a green hydrogen mission, which is taking green hydrogen mission very seriously and very strongly and forcefully. PM Kusum is very successful scheme of Government of India, where we have set up decentralized solar plants in the fields, and in turns giving farmers two benefits. One, that he can get some side income by generating solar power, and he reduces his own expenditure by making his pumps more efficient and solar power driven. This is a very successful initiative of Government of India. Next. Then in construction of roads, we have allowed green technology to be used and many of the pollutant to be used so that they can go into road construction and less impact on the environment is coming up. So we have allowed up to 10%, at some places more than 10% also, use of plastic in road construction. We have also mandated use of fly ash in road construction if this is, in the radius of 300 kilometers of the thermal power plant. We have mandated rainwater harvesting for all households through bylaws beyond a particular size of the plot. So they have to go mandatory for it. And then greening of highways is also under, progress. Next. This is very important. And I think when we talk of infrastructure, we generally talk in terms of, climate disasters, natural hazards, things like that. But social resilience is equally important. And we in India recognize this aspect very strongly. And we say that when we talk of, disaster resilient infrastructure, it is also in terms of social resilience. So infrastructure should be free of all divides, whether there is a urban-rural divide or there is a digital divide or there any sort of divide. So infrastructure should be free of these divides. Any citizen of a country can, take benefit of this infrastructure, can use infrastructure in an equitable way. And the benefits coming out of infrastructure development in a country should also reach out to the citizens in an equitable way. So that is a very key feature and driver of our infrastructure vision. Next. So for example, in Housing for All schemes, we have started Housing for All, where we are, constructing houses for poor in urban areas as well as in rural area. And by 2023 or maybe by 2024, we'll reach saturation state where 100% housing for all will be ensured. And it's not only housing for all, but also tap water supply to all houses. So for tap water supply, one should not go beyond his house to some other common water tap or so. Every house should get a assured tap water supply. Then, in many countries, including India, property divisions are skewed towards male dominance. So to ensure that and to provide that females are equally participants of the infrastructure development benefits and they are reaping out all these benefits also, we have decided that all houses built under this Housing for All schemes will be registered in the name of the lady of that household, so that she gets a protection, economic protection and a protection against disasters which may happen not only in terms of natural disasters but otherwise also. Similarly, for digital infrastructure, we have provided, our digital services are cheapest in the world. So every citizen in India now can use telephone, mobile telephone, internet without any digital divide. But there is still some digital divides exist in terms of geographical reach. So there are some difficult terrains in the country. There are some underdeveloped area where still fiber connectivity is not there, or the mobile data speed is not very high. So to bridge that digital divide, we have come up with BharatNet project, where every village will be connected through a high-speed broadband fiber connection. And that infrastructure development will be taken in PPP mode rather than a government executed project. Next. So what is the way forward? So way forward is, of course, improving upon all these initiatives and taken into initiatives. But from NIP perspective, there is a requirement to comb the NIP projects, because there are more than 9,500 projects. There is a requirement to comb the projects and to find out projects which are more, ESG compliant and projects which are less ESG compliant, and set out such kind of, prioritization mechanism through which investors can find out quickly and easily which projects are more ESG compliant, and therefore they may get more traction for investment into those projects. So that we are already working with World Bank, and their toolkits will be used for combing and prioritizing of these projects as per not only ESG compliance but other considerations also. Next. Then we have also taken up reviews of some of the state projects, infrastructure state projects, with the help of CDRI, and CDRI is going to states and appraising those projects, infrastructure projects, from disaster resilience point of view, and in coming future that will be expanded to other states in the country also. We have very robust system of PPP development with model concession agreements, and we are also reviewing these model concession agreements to ensure that they adhere to disaster resilience goals and best practices, international best practices. Similarly for EFC committee also, because government sponsored infrastructure projects are appraised by EFC committee, so there also the format is under change. And then we are working on development of generally accepted principle for disaster resilience infrastructure and how they could be applied across key infrastructure sectors. And then developing toolkits. We have already developed toolkits for infrastructure project preparation. So if you want to, any project sponsoring authority in the country, if they want to prepare a project, they can take help of these toolkits. But now these toolkits are being developed to ensure that environmental and disaster and resilience concerns are also getting addressed to these toolkits. Thank you. Next. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. It's really great to see so many projects moving forward and such an alignment with the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals across the board of these projects. I would like to ask my fellow panelists for some questions or comments on this presentation. Before we do that, just really quickly on the response we received from the first poll. So participants have given 89% to blended finance, which underlines really the need for the public and private sector to work together on this vast challenge that lies ahead. And Mr. Purushottam also emphasized blended finance as one of the sources of finance that India is looking into. So I do see some raised hands here from the fellow panelists today, and I'd like to ask Nina to come in first.
Thank you very much. May I say, EIB is a big investor in infrastructure in India. I think we've invested 3.1 billion in India, actually, a lot of that in infrastructure and together with the Ministry of Finance. So it's really an honor to have the chance to comment today. I want to be very quick because I can see some of my other panelists have their hands up, but I wanted to make 3 quick comments. So firstly, I think it's a really good signal, actually, that we have Mr. Purushottam from the Ministry of Finance here today. We don't have a technical ministry, but we have the Ministry of Finance as playing its coordinating role and really putting these issues of disaster resilience, of climate resilience, front and center, and not seeing them, purely as ESG concerns, but as, core financial risks, actually. And that's really the way that EIB sees it as well. So, you know, we are also a long-term investor. Our tenors are sort of 20 to 30 years. And that's why, you know, when we appraise a project, when we look at where we're going to invest, we really take these issues very seriously. And that's why I'm here today with my colleague who looks, you know, at the technical side of these climate and disaster risk issues. So, you know, I was reading through the NIP presentations and, you know, to see the discussion of, you know, improving standards, these toolkits, you know, helping the project promoters to improve the implementation. I think this is really great. And it's something that's very exciting and reassuring to us as investors. So I'd like to congratulate actually the Ministry of Finance and the Indian government for their sort of far-sighted approach on that. The second thing, you know, I wanted to say, I think this NIP can be a really great tool to bring in investors, you know, by giving the investors an overview of the projects and also by giving, you know, really empowering the Ministry of Finance to direct us and to coordinate us. You know, I think there are a lot of investors who are very interested in India, and there's no need for us to compete actually, because there are so many opportunities. And I think this is really a tool that can allow the Ministry of Finance to direct us to, you know, where we're both best suited, you know, to contribute, where we can add value. And when I talk about adding value, I think the Ministry of Finance also sees that not just in terms of the financial terms that we're offering, but the kind of ideas, the expertise, the experience that we're bringing. And for EIB, a lot of that comes from our projects in Europe. And I hope that that's something that we can continue to contribute on, and somewhere where the Ministry of Finance can continue to really push us. You know, and the final point I wanted to say, I think it's great that there's a consideration of all the players here. So, you know, we're not looking only at, you know, government-backed infrastructure projects. We're thinking about, you know, how to unlock other sources of finance, how to bring in other players. We saw there mention, for instance, of the State Bank of India, the India, let me get the acronym right, Infrastructure Finance Company. Both of these are you know, partners that we've worked with before. And actually, you know, we have focused with them on clean and renewable energy, but I think in future, you know, a lot more can be done on disaster and climate resilience there. So I'll stop there because I see that others have their hands up, but you know, I really look forward to, I'm very new in this role, but I look forward to working in future on these issues and to the Ministry of Finance really continuing to push us on this actually. Thank you.
Yeah, Daniel, may I come in?
Sure,
Yeah.
Please.
So thank you, Nina. Thank you for your comments. I think, you know, Nina is a very popular name in India, and more investment you will make, more popular this name will become. You know, so you know, for this PPP and the size of increasing PPP, yes, we are very much into it. And as you have seen that in NIP, generally, I mean, in the plan, that size is 20%, but we are trying to increase it up to 40% of the NIP. And that's why we are coming up with, you know, we have come up with National Monetization Pipeline, which talks of, you know, more than $80 billion infrastructure projects, which are brownfield projects, which are working post-COD projects, and they will be taken by private investors and developers to run them for next 30, 40 years. So this is a big initiative by Government of India to allow bringing private efficiency into running and management of infrastructure projects. And lot of, you know, positive responses have been made by investors, global investors, and many global investors have already invested into that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina and Mr. Purushottam for your comments and for your response as well. Dicky, I think you have raised your hand and you would like to come in here.
I would, thank you. And I thought that was an inspiring presentation to show about the huge amount of work that's been done on the sort of transition plan. I suppose inevitably for countries like India and others, of course, too, there will be a challenge of stranded assets that could cause financial risk as part of that transition. And I wondered how you're going to try and deal with that, that difficulty of those stranded assets.
Thank you, Dicky, for your question. You know, there are few stranded assets, we understand. Traditionally, India has not reached to that level of infrastructure development where one infrastructure asset is put in unused and next infrastructure asset nearby is being constructed. But there are many stranded assets in different context of this, you know, word. For example, in digital spectrum, some of the part of spectrum taken over by concessionaires, they are not in use. Similarly, there are many power project assets in especially Northeast and across the country also, which have been taken over but not developed, so potential is unused. Similarly, there are many stranded assets in other sectors also. Now, how to go about it? One way which we are working on it, and we are making policies. So it cannot be one policy for all infrastructure sector. And in India, infrastructure, a particular sector of infrastructure is looked after by a particular ministry. So every ministry is working on making policy how to bring back those stranded assets into their fold so that they can rebid out. And the policy is being prepared from point of view of resolving all the legal issues involved and all the financing issue involved, because some of the projects have seen some of the investment by those concessionaire or developers. So we don't want giving a bad deal to them also. So the idea is that they should be compensated. If they want to develop it, a further time period may be given, but if they don't want to develop it, they should be compensated for their investment made. The asset should be taken back by the ministry or the concerned PSU and then should be rebidded. Similar position is there in many of the mines also. Mines have been taken, but they are not being put into effective use. So these are some of the areas where we have identified stranded assets and policies are under preparation.
Thank you very much, and yeah, thank you, Dicky, for raising this important topic as well. Rowan, I think your hand was raised earlier. Perhaps you also have a question to the India presentation.
Yeah, thanks. Like Dicky, I thought it was an inspiring session, and thank you so much. I just wanted to get a sense of what some of the financial drivers might be, and Dicky highlighted the sort of the risk of stranded assets, but at the same time, financial drivers will be important. Do you sense that the financial system in India, including the credit rating agencies, will be looking to incorporate this risk into their decision making to essentially ensure that the resilience which we all want is actually properly valued by the markets and given the respect it deserves? It sometimes sounds ironic that we need to account for the risk. It sounds rather negative, but once we do that, all the good things that we're doing then have value, don't they?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important issue, and assessing financial risk and assessing the credit of that project is very important. And to address those issues, we have come up with a revised credit assessment policy, credit rating policy. CRISIL has prepared a new credit rating system, which we are trying to popularize it across infrastructure sectors. For two issues, infrastructure investment made by developers or investors are far more secure than any other investment, because in infrastructure projects, if you read our model concession agreements or any other concession agreements, you will find that they are fully backed by very robust termination payment systems. So in case project gets into failure because of disaster or because of any other thing, so there are force majeure clauses and there are termination clauses which adequately compensate the investors in terms of his investment being made. So financial risk wise, infrastructure projects in India are less risky and more creditworthy. This is one. Number two, that there is also a system of enhancing the credit rating of that project by giving some kind of credit guarantee. So we are, as I have discussed, that we have a DFI, NAFED. One of the job role of NAFED is to provide credit enhancement support to infrastructure projects. And we are also contemplating on coming up with a standalone credit support company which will further take infrastructure projects by supporting a part of financing or guaranteeing a part of recovery, and therefore enhancing the credit rating of that infrastructure project. For assessment of disaster risk, I have already discussed these things. Some of the assessment pro forma are already there. They are part of SEBI guidelines and SEBI formats also. Whenever a project is under preparation, those issues are analyzed and properly filled in. And therefore, when it comes to appraisal by various bodies, whether they are investors, developers, bankers, or the PPPAC, we see into that these concerns are adequately taken care of. Not only environmental concerns, but also social concerns. But still, there is a lot of work to be done, and we have already taken up those issues. And in near future, I think the formats of analyzing and assessing infrastructure and disaster resilience dimensions would be much more robust.
Thanks so much, Mr. Puratharsh. It's so exciting to see how integrated all this is becoming in India. Very exciting.
Thank you.
Indeed, and thank you very much again for providing such great insights and so much details, for sharing so much details on this exciting and very challenging endeavor that you are taking on. Let us move ahead with more country insights, now shifting our focus to South America and Peru in particular. And I understand we have a pre-recorded presentation by Mr. Ernesto Lopez on Peru's national infrastructure pipeline. So can I ask the studio to play this presentation, please?
Good morning. I'm Ernesto Lopez Mariovich, General Director of Private Investment Promotion Policies of Ministry of the Economy and Finance of Peru. And it is a pleasure for me to present as panelist in such an important event as the final session of the International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We are responsible at MEF for conducting the National System of Private Investment Promotion, which regulates the formulation and evaluation of a process for public-private partnerships in Peru, and is responsible for the issue of binding interpretation of the legal framework and opinions within the evaluation process of PPPs. It is within this framework that we have developed the National Infrastructure Plan for Competitiveness. With this, I would like to continue with my presentation. About the National Infrastructure Plan from Peru, we could say that it is more than a list of prioritized projects. We intended to be a roadmap that identifies the prioritized projects of Peru, but also we would like to think of it as a planning tool that will contribute to the national development. The projects comprised in the plan represent an investment of $31,000. And we must take into account that the access gap that we have determined a couple of years ago in the sectors that are that comprise the plan is over $32,000 million. The first version of the National Infrastructure Plan, which was called National Infrastructure Plan for Competitiveness, was published in 2019, and it comprises a list of 52 projects of high competitive impact. Among these prioritized projects, we can find projects from different sectors. For example, in transportation sector, we have airports, trains, ports, subway lines. In communication sectors, we have concessions for internet broadband connection. In the agricultural sector, we have projects which comprise dams and irrigation projects. In sanitation, we have projects of wastewater treatment plants. Also, we have a project regarding the provision of water to Lima, which is one of the which is our capital and one of our major cities. In the energy sector, we have gas transportation projects, and in the environment, we have solid waste management projects. These usually are managed or by the local governments. For 2022, we intend that we are formulating the updating of the National Plan of Infrastructure with a major focus on sustainable development. The main issues which comprise the 2019 plan were that we found out that there were isolated benefits due to projects of small scale. There was also, we also verified that there was a change in support of the government regarding some of the projects, and we have a series of stalled projects. Therefore, for the 2022 version, we are putting emphasis on the possibility of obtaining access to green financing, the fact that we would have integrated projects with added value. We are incorporating a long-term vision that would be able to put all the projects together. And also, we have put emphasis on sustainable projects from beginning to end. The sustainability approach we are introducing in the plan puts emphasis in all the life cycle of the projects, and put emphasis on the projects being sustainable from beginning to end. Among the improvements that we have considered in the 2022 version of the National Infrastructure Plan, there are the following: inclusion of a strategic vision of the sectors, the estimation of quality gaps, the introduction of the concept of sustainable infrastructure, the introduction of sustainability criteria and a prioritization methodology, the addition of social sectors like health and education. As I mentioned, our definition of sustainability comprises features of economic, financial, social, environmental, and institutional. So it's a multidimensional approach. Also, we consider integrated territorial planning, which includes disaster risk management and infrastructure, which is resilient to climate change. Also, in all this plan, we consider that the Ministry of Finance has an articulating role among sectors. We are aware at the time that we are formulating this 2022 National Infrastructure Plan, we are aware that there are some obstacles to financing the resilient and sustainable projects. It's a new line of finance, so we acknowledge that there are some obstacles. First, there is some possible institutional weaknesses and difficulties from the project planning perspective and the implementation. There's also lack of confidence from the private sector. We also can anticipate lack of information and guidance for using international climate financing instruments. And we also consider that there could be subnational entities that would face difficulties to access finance through these new instruments. But we are considering that there could be ways to revert to overcome these difficulties. So to deal with possible institutional weaknesses and possible difficulties in planning, financing, and executing projects, we think that when financing trends not to follow, the National Infrastructure Plan would consider only the projects that are duly planned and adequately financed in the public investment and public investment systems. Also, to address the lack of confidence of the private sector and face the difficulties in preparing projects, it would be necessary to strengthen institutional capacity, and other aspects that can be used to measure the performance of an investment. In this sense, the Peruvian private investment regulations have recently considered the creation of specialized bodies for the management and execution of projects, which are considered as the equivalent of project management offices, the PMOs, which will assure the performance of the project in a sustainable and planned manner. Also, to improve management in the face of inconveniences for the use of international climate financing instruments such as the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Fund, which have funds reserved to governments, national and subnational governments, the National Infrastructure Plan will contain a roadmap with a solid program that will allow a paradigm shift in all phases of investment projects, both in mitigation of emissions and in reduction of vulnerability to climate change. Finally, to facilitate the access of some national entities to financing through multilateral banking, their capacities will be strengthened in order to reduce the lack of credit independence. This is my presentation for today. I thank you again for the opportunity to be here and wish you a very successful program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mr. Ernesto Lopez. I don't know if there are any participants from Peru. A warm thank you again for providing this video message. Unfortunately, we won't be able to ask questions to this on this presentation. I thought the obstacles were very clearly laid out and probably provide some impulse for the discussion later on. But let's move forward with someone who is here with us today, Mr. Solomon Asamoah, who will now share some insights on Ghana's infrastructure plan. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and happy to be invited, and thank you for the invitation. I'm the CEO of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, which is a government-owned vehicle set up by the government of Ghana to really focus on developing infrastructure assets across Ghana. My presentation, I've been told to keep it very short, so it's just a brief summary. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so I'll quickly give an overview of Ghana's infrastructure plan, the high-level priority areas, and then I'll talk about the role of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund in terms of leveraging funding into infrastructure assets and developing infrastructure assets throughout Ghana. I'll talk a little bit about how we handle ENS and climate-related issues, and how we're incorporating those into our way of doing infrastructure projects across Ghana. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just a high-level overview of Ghana's infrastructure plan. It's not too dissimilar from other countries' infrastructure plans. We've recognized centrally throughout the government the importance of climate-related events have the potential to cause significant damage to our infrastructure. As most of you will be aware, Africa, unfortunately, suffers highly from the negative effects of climate-related issues, but contributes least to its causes. So we have to really take the initiative and make sure that our infrastructure that we're building now is more resilient, and making sure that we actually go back and enhance the existing infrastructures that we have in place. So we have a number of key sectors where we focused upon developing resilient infrastructure throughout Ghana. The agricultural area is something that we've been focused on. Mass transportation systems, making sure that they're sustainable. The energy sector is one that we've had a lot of focus on in Ghana. Ghana actually happens to be in a rare situation in that we have surplus generation compared to our projected needs at the moment. And when we do start taking new generation, we will be increasing the mix of renewables in our power sector. Mass affordable housing, student accommodation. We are trying to focus on new structures that are more sustainable and more resilient. We have participated more generally in the IFC Edge certification program, making sure that our new buildings reach those standards as well. And then water waste management systems is an area that we've also been focusing on in Ghana. Next slide, please. So these are some of the major sectors, as I mentioned, that we've been focused on. Most of our infrastructure to date has been driven by the ministries and the public sector in collaboration with donors. And we've made some significant progress in those particular areas. But what we've focused on, what we've realized the gap is, in many African countries the same, is that we need to better leverage the private sector and other sources of financing. Next slide, please. And we've noticed that in certain sectors, there is an appetite and awareness from the private sector, both domestically and internationally, to bring their financing to these projects. The challenge for Africa has always been the reforms have taken place in many countries in opening up to the private sector, but still the level of private sector financing hasn't followed what many people have wanted and wished for. And I always tell my colleagues in government, unfortunately, half of the reforms do not yield you half of the results. And so you have to go the whole hog through in your reforms to make an environment that's attractive to the private sector. Next slide, please. So essentially, I want to focus a little bit more on the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund and the role that we play in leveraging private sector and resilient infrastructure into Ghana. Next slide, please. The Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, GIF, is pretty much a very unique vehicle that was set up with a unique role in Ghana. The government initially set it up and provided $345 million of anchor equity to this investment vehicle, permanent investment vehicle. And they did something that is very rare across Africa and probably many countries. It gave a degree of independence to this government-owned vehicle to make investment decisions not directed on day-to-day basis by the government. So it has an independent board, technical management team, and the sole aim of this vehicle is to leverage private sector investments and show that the government has put its risk capital, put its money where its mouth is, and by taking these initiatives, unlock private sector financing. And the way that we've done that is by essentially making sure that we operate to the international standards necessary to attract private financing, and with a very targeted selection on the type of projects that we invest in that are attractive to the private sector in the infrastructure space. Next slide, please. So we commenced operations in 2015, 100% owned by the government of Ghana, as I mentioned, and all paid in equity balance sheets of $345 million. I touched upon the unique governance structure, which allows our board is essentially private sector players, and they have been delegated day-to-day responsibility. But because it's a government-owned vehicle, there needs to be necessarily government oversight. And so we have an advisory committee that sits on top of the private of the fund of the board, and that is chaired by the Minister of Finance himself. The governor of the central bank is also on that advisory committee, along with the Director General of the National Development Planning Commission, which is once responsible for the overall coordination of infrastructure projects throughout the country. So we have heavy government oversight and influence, but there's also two private sector players which have actually been specified to be female, also on the advisory committee. And that provides this very important link between what Ghana Infrastructure Fund does and makes sure it's aligned to the government priorities of the country. Next slide, please. And the results have been quite impressive to date in a relatively short space of time. Next slide, please. The fund has invested some $315 million in 13 infrastructure transactions across Ghana. But the key point is that for every $1 that GIF has put into an investment, it's managed to attract $10 of other sources of money from the private sector and from other sources, which means that this $350 million will, when the projects are completed, attracted over $3 billion of investment into the infrastructure sector in Ghana. And that is quite a good return on the investment that the government did. We do it by a combination of debt and equity investments. And we've managed to invest across 7 different sectors already. One of the key considerations for us is that every single sponsor that we've backed so far has been a Ghanaian sponsor. And we've leveraged, as I said, international money to back those projects within Ghana. We have a mantra, which is to do world-class projects with local sponsors and raise the level of Ghanaian participation in infrastructure. 7 of these projects are already operational, generating cash flows. 3 of them are in construction and 3 of them are in development. And we have a very healthy pipeline of about $5 billion of other transactions that we have coming in that we're working on at the moment. Next slide, please. Just a couple of examples of some of the projects. If anybody's been to Ghana in the last couple of years, you'll notice that we've had a new airport terminal there, which has been awarded one of the best airports in Africa. We were involved in that, and we enabled to put together the DFI tranche, where we worked with the African Development Bank and the Development Bank of Southern Africa to complete the financing and bring long-term financing to complete the construction of the airport. We're also doing a major expansion on the port side. We've established a new oil jetty, and in the next slide, we've also done a major expansion in Ghana's second port, where we put in $58 million. We've managed to raise close to $300 million of financing to expand the second port. Communication connectivity is a major issue in Africa, in Ghana. As many of you will know, we've managed to make huge inroads in the mobile digital space across the continent. And so that doesn't require any financing from the Ghana Infrastructure Fund. But really the blockage is broadband, access to broadband and data connectivity. So we've established a joint venture with the private sector where we're laying terrestrial fiber across the whole of the country, including those underserved areas. And this will be a wholesale play that will increase connectivity and reduce the price of connectivity, and really unlock the private sector to take advantage of activities in the digital space in Ghana. Next slide, please. We've also been very involved in the power sector, making sure that Ghana, as we said, is surplus in power at the moment by investing in IPPs. And one important project from a climate sustainable perspective is a project that will use the flared gas from the oil fields as a fuel source to convert into electricity that goes into the grid. So you can imagine the positive impacts that will have on the environment. Next slide, please. And then we've also bringing up the level of sustainability in our hospitality sector, both in terms of existing hostels, but future hospitality projects. Where, as I mentioned, we've done a partnership with IFC to make sure that our buildings will all be EDGE certified and make sure that we capture those levels in the buildings and set the standard moving forward in the country. Next slide, please. Ecotourism is an area that Ghana potentially has a competitive advantage in, and we're trying to again move the needle in terms of creating the first ecotourism safari project in the country in conjunction with the private sector. And student accommodation is another area that there's a silent crisis in Ghana, and we're making sure that new student accommodation will meet the highest levels of sustainability using renewables as well as other green practices. Next slide, please. So in terms of the way that we view and we manage the environmental and social risk, we make sure that everything that we do is aligned to the Equator Principles, and we follow the IFC World Bank environmental standards in all of our projects. That has become absolutely necessary if you're looking to raise any funding from the markets. And we have a strict adherence to that policy requirement. And this has had a knock-on effect in the country in that other projects that are being done also taking the lead of the funding that we've managed to raise and making sure that their projects meet those standards as well. Next slide, please. We also make sure that we track and we monitor. Can you go back? Can you go back to the previous slide, please? Yes. Okay, just hold it there for a second. So we also measure the development outcomes, including gender of all our projects. And again, this is a very important requirement for unlocking sources of private sector and other DFI funding in our projects. And we work closely with the Environment Ministry as well as the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana. Next slide, please.
Solomon, just very briefly, if I could ask you to wrap it up.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So we have the last couple of slides here, and this is the one that I really wanted to talk a little bit about. There's been a lot of talk about PPP projects and unlocking private sector investments. What we found is that we've been very successful in that particular area in a relatively short space of time. But adding the resilient component to infrastructure costs funding. And we find that usually the private sector, although they take a reasonably long-term view in infrastructure, they look at their projects obviously from a commercial perspective. So the use of selected and targeted concessional funds, the so-called blended finance, if we're going to address this issue, is extremely important. And we found ways to structure them in our projects. And that's going to be a very important component of making sure that we build the resilient infrastructure that we require. Next slide, please. And we've also been working in terms of the fundraising that we're doing from the DFIs. We're working with the World Bank, the French Development Agency, the African Development Bank to enhance both the skills and the capacity of institutions like GIF to enable to address these issues more successfully. I think that's the final slide, I believe. Yes, so thank you for your attention. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Solomon, and really interesting and innovative example how to draw in the private sector, something other countries and we all, for that matter, can learn from. I see Roman has a question, and I'd like to ask you to keep it brief because we still have some questions to other panelists after this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks to Mr. Asamoah. That was really a great presentation about the GIF, and congratulations for putting this comprehensive plan together for Ghana. Given that EIB has been investing in Ghana for many, many years, it's really great to have the opportunity to comment. And myself, I'm coming from the physical climate risk sort of context, so I'm curious to really learn more about sort of your journey in mainstreaming, you know, a physical climate risk management approach into the fund. I know this is something that can be seen in the context of the general sustainability requirements of MDBs, and I know from my experience that it's a complex issue to tackle. So I was impressed to see the progress you've already done in your organization. I wanted to really learn a bit more about. Can you reflect on challenges, difficulties, in rewarding outcomes? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Just a very quick response to that. The attitude that we've brought, and it's paid us dividends, is that if you really want to change your infrastructure, you have to raise the financing. If you really want to raise the financing, you have to look at what's important to financiers. And what's important to financiers at the moment is sustainable issues, particularly long-term DFI financing. So if you can structure your projects that address those issues, you're more likely to be able to raise the financing. And that's been a lesson that hasn't been lost on other Ghanaian institutions. They've been surprised and impressed by the amount of money that we've managed to raise for our projects. And then looking at the ways that we've done that. So there is a knock-on effect. And I think it's very important that we've structured our projects so they attract international long-term financing. The final point I would just emphasize is the point that I made. We need more concessional financing, blended financing, to go with the private sector financing. And we need to make sure it's structured so we know where the subsidies are, we know how long they last, and we make sure that we don't over-reward the private sector with providing them too much cushion underneath. So well-structured uses of blended finance, I think, is going to be the key going forward for unlocking more financing for infrastructure in Africa. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot also for this interesting question, Roman, and for your response. We have about 8 minutes left, but I really like to get some of the experiences and perspectives from the panelists into this last part of the session. And I'd like to ask Rowan first to come in. And we heard just now from a great example how the private sector can be brought into the transitioning to resilient infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure. But we also heard from some of the challenges, both from Peru and India. And in your experience, having worked in the private sector, insurance with banks, insurers, institutional investors, what role do you think can the private sector play in planning and investing for resilient infrastructure? And what are some of the key barriers that we need to address from your experience? Rowan, are you still with us?
I'm just returning. I'm afraid my screen went blue and everything crashed. So I'm so sorry about that. And now the sun's in my eyes. So I've just rejoined. I wonder if you could kindly go to someone else, because I've sort of literally just recovered myself.
No worries. I can ask that question again in just a second, but maybe then asking Dickie first, because this is equally important, and especially when it comes to making this transition resilient and risk informed. Where in the process of planning and investing into infrastructure does risk assessment and risk modeling techniques generate value and influence the pricing of risk?
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, I mean, I think, you know, one sometimes forgets that the importance of risk is a foundation for so much in society, and we've been working with you and many others to try and do what we call about the democratization of risk. And if you think about it as almost as a management tool, so there you can think about options for looking at mitigation, adaptation, and of course, sort of risk transfer. So if we think of that as the foundation, and within that, actually, I should make the point that the standards that we use are so critically important to being able to do this across different sectors and different countries and different international organizations. So that's the sort of background. When you're looking at infrastructure, I think there are some particular challenges. That means to some degree that it's been, I think, a little behind. So one of the challenges is the duration of the finance. So that makes life a bit hard. The changing ownership of infrastructure projects also produces some challenges. So I think where risk can play a role here, and in fact, Mr. Asamoah just mentioned this partially, is by trying to increase the transparency about what the risk is, particularly focused on climate and sustainable issues, and being able to use the international standards that are developing all around the world to try and create a common language around risk that can facilitate the ability of countries around the world to begin to understand this better, to be able to monitor and adapt to the changing environment that we're all facing, and then to be able to make sure that they can get the best financing options, because those financing options are going to understand the methods and the standards that are being used to understand that risk. And I think if we were all better at that, and in fact, I know there are several people on this call, not least the Insurance Resilience Organization, which has been championing this, not least the Insurance Development Forum, which was mentioned earlier that Rowan helped set up a few years ago, are really beginning to push this international approach to understanding risk using common and open standards. And if we start doing that a bit more, I think we'll be in a much, much better position. So thank you, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Dickie. This has been very, very brief and straight to the point, very, very informative. Rowan, back to you. The role of the private sector, we heard about it, both in terms of its benefits and a great case, a great example from Ghana on how to actually leverage the private sector, but also some of the challenges were shared by Peru in particular. From your experience, having worked in the private sector with insurers, institutional investors, pension funds, etc., where do you see the private sector, particularly the insurance industry, coming in, and what are some of the barriers that we need to address?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Well, funny enough, as we speak, there's a group called the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, a partner of CGRI, currently in Jamaica, completing a country assessment of Jamaica's risk with the government, using tools that Dickie's been behind, which is great, to prioritize resilient infrastructure investment in the country. And what's happened is a team of engineers, financiers, obviously government folks, have been working together on this for the last year. And I've been also working on the DNA, if I can put it like that, of getting the physics into finance. So some of us from the reinsurance world have experienced in the last 20 years how risk modeling has got into the very essence of each individual transaction. But that's very rare. And what we're now doing is to make that happen in the transaction, if you like, design of infrastructure investment. And what that's meaning is that once the physical risk is incorporated into all the equations and work that investors have to undertake, then the risk is then very clearly demonstrated in their terms, in their language. And the requirement for contingent finance could be insurance, could be parametric insurance, could be all the other instruments we've talked about. So what has needed to happen, and it's happening very quickly around the world, and it's happening in Peru, it's happening in India, it's certainly happening in Ghana, is that these communities and professions who haven't worked together, basically financiers and economists outside of insurance, haven't had to use maps before. They've just had to use spreadsheets. So we're all working on a new sort of integration. And I really see that in the next 2 or 3 years, the revolution that we saw in reinsurance and insurance will happen across the financial system, public and private, and that will create the common sort of requirements. Then the challenges of, you often hear pipelines, and that will begin to go away, because actually we'll have all been working on things upstream together. So we've seen it in insurance, haven't we, Daniel? I think we're going to see it across investment, and that integration in the investment side will draw in the requirement for insurance-like instruments to manage this risk. So an exciting time. And once we do that, we'll begin to shift capital to protect lives and livelihoods, as well as assets. And of course, the theme of this event has been getting the people back into this conversation. And ironically, I think this sort of financial revolution will be what protects those basic rights of life and livelihood.
Thank you very much, Rowan, for really making the connection between the innovations in finance that we're seeing and the actual betterment of lives and livelihoods in the face of the climate crisis. I understand we still have 3 minutes before we close, so I'd like to get and maybe to wrap up Roman's perspective on the role of international financing institutions in this massive challenge and how those can support different economies with varying levels of risk, investment and capital expenditure priorities to make this transition towards resilient infrastructure.
Thanks, Daniel. I think, I mean, on the one hand, multilateral development banks have a lot to offer and also still a lot to learn, given the magnitude and complexity of the challenges we've been discussing today. But let me focus a bit on climate resilient infrastructure and adaptation in general, where I think MDBs have really a pretty catalytic role to play. So MDBs are certainly not new in this space, and they've provided substantial support for resilient infrastructure in the past. The EIB alone, for example, invested $2.7 billion in adaptation measures in 2020. The vast majority was in public sector infrastructure projects with multiple co-benefits for communities and businesses. And that is just the percentage for the actual adaptation finance. It's not the entire project investment costs. So sometimes these are just a couple of small percentages of the overall envelope. So you can see that this is actually touching a pretty large amount of financing. MDBs can also cooperate together to make large investments in projects or programs viable, and they can de-risk projects and to a certain extent crowd in additional public and private finance. So this is really the catalytical role. I think that is a big value add. And aside from financing, MDBs can support through knowledge, advice, and tested procedures and tools for managing climate risk. For example, when mainstreaming resilience upstream in policymaking and planning, when considering physical climate risk in individual project preparation situations, and also very important for building institutional resilience in organizations. In addition, several MDBs, including very much the EIB, have pledged to further increase their ambition and to do much more for adaptation globally. So in our new EIB adaptation plan, for example, we committed to growing our adaptation finance volume substantially over the next couple of years until 2025. We also increased our risk appetite in enabling us to finance, for example, up to 75%, in some cases even more of an adaptation project. And we will offer more advisory and technical assistance to clients, especially with a focus on vulnerable countries. I'll wrap up now in the interest of time, but I also wanted to re-emphasize that we need to work on common language. I fully support the statement of the other speakers today. And I think the MDBs have come a long way already in coordinating their own procedures and approaches, and new initiatives like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the EU taxonomy. They are more and more compatible and complementary to the MDB approaches. So I see a convergence there towards a common language, and I think that is very important for making resilient investment projects more attractive and viable for a broader range of investors. As we've heard today, many of us want to see, and there's really a lot to do, so we need all hands on deck. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roman, for this. I think this is actually a great summary in terms of the convergence we need in the space, public and private sector working together. We heard about the need for concessional finance to actually leverage private the private sector. We heard that it's not only about economic infrastructure, but also social infrastructure, that there are co-benefits between the SDGs, climate mitigation, and adaptation and resilience that can be seized, and that we need a common language, but also transparency on risk and a risk understanding that needs to go into each of these transactions. So again, thank you very much to all panelists, to the country presentations, which have been incredibly insightful, always really important to contrast this with what's actually happening on the ground. There is also a flagship report that the coalition is currently preparing on finance for resilient infrastructure. So stay tuned with the coalition on its publishing. And thanks to everyone who has joined the session, and have a great rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.